This is assignment 4.3, data collections. So the first way of collecting data that we're going to be looking at is a case study. So what exactly is a case study? So this is a detailed investigation of a single person, but it doesn't have to be a single person, it could also be a group or a community of people. So like a football team, basketball team, something like that. Usually this data is gathered by interviewing the people, so you could have a group focus kind of thing, so have one big group of people and interview them all in the big group, or you can just do it one-on-one. An example of this would be collecting data from under 18 female gymnasts. So the advantages of this would be the conclusions, because you have to write down what you found. These conclusions could be quite detailed or very detailed, because you're going from the beginning to the end of the research of the experiments. So you're looking at the entire experiment, or the way that you're finding this data. Also, you get an unbiased introduction. So basically what I mean by that is when you're looking at the case study, you don't see it from the researcher's point of view, and you don't see it from the participant's point of view. You see it from just an outsider's point of view, so it's just not biased. Also, the data that is found can be used to improve lifestyles, which is why that's the next advantage. So basically, say you got results that you're not happy with, you can then use these to then better your lifestyle to help improve that area. However, the disadvantage is the results could be biased to that researcher. So that researcher wants to find X, but they actually find Y. They could then manipulate this data to show that it does actually find what they wanted it to. These can also, or case studies can also take quite a while to conduct. So that is a disadvantage, because it could take a few years to finish the case study, because you could be looking at it over a long period of time. And it would also be hard to link this data to the general public, because say you're looking at young female gymnasts, they're a very select group of people, so you can't say that an under 18 female gymnast results affect a 34-year-old male. Next up we have comparative, which is basically just comparing two or more things. Research methodology of collecting data that compares more than one thing. It involves comparison and contrast between two or more sets of data. And as you can see, the example here would be measuring and comparing vertical jump tests of young female gymnasts aged 10 and 12. So the advantages to this could be normative data, so you could easily compare it to the normative data. So you could see if these young female gymnasts aged 10 are hitting below or on or above the normative data. This data that you also find could be easily ranked. You could see which 10-year-old, which 12-year-old jumps the highest, and which one jumps the lowest. And then this data can also easily be put in tables, so it can easily be read by yourself and other people if you need to go over it again. Disadvantage of this would be generalization of data. So you could say you're looking for the mean. You could have like 2 or 3 10-year-olds that jump really high, but then the rest of them jump average or below average. So then when you're looking at the mean wouldn't be fair to those people that jumped really high, because obviously it would show their results as being lower. And it's also it can also be biased, because the researcher again could just very easily manipulate the results and just note down something else if they wanted to see a different result. Longitudinal is next. So a longitudinal study is a study that's conducted over a long period of time. So for example, it could take 3 years, it could take more, it could take decades. An example of this would be over 5 years testing the flexibility of a young female gymnast and how it changes. An advantage of this type of research would be patterns, so looking at the different patterns between each gymnast. So you could see that one gradually increases, one could stay the same, one could decrease. With this data, you could then put it into a table, which would be another advantage, because obviously you'll easily be able to read the data, especially on like a scatter graph or something. You would also be able to see what influences them, and seeing how that changes their results. Disadvantages though, this could be time, because it takes a long period of time. You wouldn't have final results for a few years, so you wouldn't really be able to do anything else. I suppose you could have other ongoing research to take up the time, but this specific set of research will take quite a while to get the end result of. It could also be bias, because after all that time you might want a certain result, so you don't want to be like conducting experiments for that long and then find like some terrible results or something that's just really something that you didn't want to find. So from there you might just manipulate it, change it so it's exactly what you wanted it or more like what you want it to be. Next up is a correlational study. This determines whether two variables are linked together. It aims to discover if an increase or a decrease in one variable causes an increase or decrease in another. An example could be the effect of stretching on a young female gymnast's performance. So the advantages of this, it could determine whether there is a link between two variables. So you could see if X influences Y. Another advantage could be how the results are a lot more applicable to everyday life, because you could see if stretching does increase performance, this could be the case and would most likely be the case for other people as well, not just young female gymnasts. Now on to disadvantages. So here I've put it doesn't always, or it's not always a conclusion. This is because you can't always 100% say that X causes Y or Y causes X, or X equals a change in Y, stuff like that. Because it could be like other variables that are influenced somehow, like you might not be controlling them properly. Next I put the influence on variables. Which it literally just means that you can't always check to see if they influence each other and if that's the proper result. Next is a cross-sectional study. What this is a type of descriptive observational study involving measurements of different variables in a population of interest at a single point in time. It's taken from a sample population. An example would be to measure the height, or the jump height rather, of 16, 18, 20 and 22-year-olds, and then after year 2 years measure it again on each of the variables, but make sure that you're measuring, say, another 16-year-old. It's not always the same person that you're measuring. So say you measured one 16-year-old, you don't have to measure them when they hit 18, or a 22-year-old after those 2 years, you don't measure them when they're 24. This is a low cost, which is an advantage, because you don't want to be spending, say you've got funding, you don't want to be spending all of the money you got from funding just on one experiment, or at least just early on the experiment you'll want to save some money. It's a very easy way to collect data as well, because like say it is that example, you're literally just either getting a proper piece of equipment, or you could just have a board that slides up, and then you can tap it, like depending on their height, they can jump up, and then you can measure there how high they jump. A disadvantage would be you can't say why this happens. So say a 16-year-old jumps higher than an 18-year-old, You can't say why that is. It doesn't give very fine evidence. Again, like lots of other ways to gather research, it's prone to bias, like or researcher bias, because the researcher could be influencing it in a different way. They might not control all the variables that they should be. They could just change the results upright as well, which obviously is a disadvantage because you're not getting true results. Next up is experimental. This is a procedure carried out to test a hypothesis. It provides an insight into cause and effect by demonstrating what happens when a variable is manipulated. An example of this: does a chosen substance increase the power levels of young female gymnasts? So you could be testing how far they can jump, how high they can jump, different stuff like that that could be or play a big part in, say, a floor routine. This is a very efficient way of collecting data because it's really straightforward. It's very easy, so you can complete it multiple times. It's really quick, which then moves us on to the next point, which is repeatable and reliable. So because it's so easy and you're doing it your own way, you know you can repeat it. And because you can repeat it, you'll probably be getting the same results. Or if you are repeating and you get different results, then you can keep or repeat it again, which will then test the results each time that you get. It will also be in a controlled environment because it's an experiment. So then you know that that there isn't some random thing that can happen that will influence it all. However, a problem with the controlled environment is that it will be most likely in a lab or something like that, something along those lines. So it will create a very artificial situation. And by this, what I mean is instead of actually performing on a proper floor for a floor routine or doing anything like that, they could just be doing it on a lab floor or just in a lab anywhere. So it's just not very fair because it's not testing them in their real environment. It's also very expensive because of the lab time. This is just a really expensive way to collect data, and it's also very prone to human error because you as a researcher will have to try and judge how much this chosen substance to give. So say you're measuring out how much to give. You could do something to increase or decrease the amount that you're giving to each of the person or each of the people and not realise. Okay, so next up we've got primary and secondary research, also known as primary and secondary data. So primary data is data that you yourself collect. So you're researching it, you're doing the experiments, then you're collecting that data. That is primary data. Then for secondary data is the data that is found by other researchers. So an example of this: you conduct an experiment on female gymnasts and get X as a result. Then you check online and find Y results from someone else who conducted the experiment earlier. A big problem with primary research is because you're doing the research yourself, it is very prone to bias from you because you will probably want a certain outcome from the research. So you could be manipulating it, whether it is intentionally or not non-intentionally. So that is quite a big problem. But a good thing is for primary research is you know every step that's been taken to find this research or find the results. Whereas with secondary data, a big problem is you don't know how good the quality is of the research. You don't know what steps they took to find it. However, it is very easy and quick access. You can just go online, look it up. Therefore, it's really good to use to compare your data to.